exactly.
That's definitely the main reason why we have a work instruction for art now, because quite often, like, Greg wrote the story. We didn't do any editing for the original story when it first was written.
Mhm.
He then sent all the scripts to an artist, and when eventually I finally see the artwork without even having seen the script separate, because he basically informed me of the story, but I never read the script.
Mhm.
And we get the artwork, and I'm looking at it, and I'm just like, "The hell's going on here?" And he's like, "Oh, it's this thing happening." And I'm like, "Where?" And then he's looking at it, and he's like, "Oh."
Yeah.
Just like totally not realizing what was missing, just due to the fact that you're in the story. It's very hard to like see what. Like, it's very hard to back up and look at
Exactly.
what's going on.
You have to
Mhm.
put yourself in the viewer's shoes, and they don't have the same information that you have initially. So yeah, it's like, yeah, you're saying, to step back from it. As an artist, for me, it's really hard because I put so much time into it, and I'm like, I can't change that now. Like, even if I wanted to, I can't really change it because
Yeah.
we have to move forward. But having the editor just have like, what it did for me specifically was it showed me like I need to include another aspect in our process before we jump too deep into it. And it also gives me things to think about before I start the process. So it's like, before I start, I'm thinking about taking a step back, and then I'm actually having somebody else take a step back and give it to me while we're, kind of in the starting levels of the process.
Well,
So
that's the best thing. If you get a great editor, then it's somebody who also makes you a better writer or illustrator. It's somebody who's looking at it, and not just telling you it's wrong, but explaining why it's wrong and how to think about it
exactly.
so that you don't get it wrong the next time. Like, that's one
Right.
of the things that when I'm working through Greg's script, that I'm explaining the whole time. I'm like, you made it all the way to this point, but you didn't explain how all of this other stuff got to this point. You kind of just collided them for the sake of bringing them together, but you need to like fill this in more, because like without that, what's going on, but nobody else knows
Exactly.
what's going on. And it's like, oh yeah, I forgot there's other people.
Yeah, I say this a lot. I'm better at writing plots and plot descriptions, character descriptions, and he's better at putting the story together completely. And that's why we flow so well together. That's funny. Me and Nate are kind of the same way. Like, he's kind of like, he's a real high. He has a high drive for concepts. Like, he'll just like. I mean, this guy has probably more concepts I've ever heard than anybody like any creative I've ever talked to. And it's kind of hard to manage them sometimes, because it's like, well, we have other stuff going on, so we have to like make it fit together. Yeah. And I'm kind of the one who kind of tries to do that. Like, well, how can we make this stuff fit together? I love the concept. Let's figure out how to make it work, but it has to work. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And because like we're trying to avoid the same stuff that you're talking about, where there's continuity issues. Like, we don't want to have one of our heroes doing two different storylines that are supposed to be either at the same time, or you don't know when they're going
Or they're
on. Like,
contradicting.
is this before, is this after? He's a completely different character type in this one, and then he's something different in this one. So we don't want to have those continuity issues. And one of our main goals as writing, in terms of writing a universe, is to not have conflictual things like that. So even like you were saying with like the DC stuff, like the DC TV show stuff, is like things will affect one another. So it's like, if this character is doing something over here, you'll see shades of it happening over here, or at least it'll affect this character to the point where they're like, man, this I have to stop this from happening, or I have to talk to this person, I have to like see what's going on with this character, like, because this is not like them. So they're interacting, even though they're not maybe in each other's storylines. You'll see it as like the storyline, the overall storyline, the overall universe storyline progresses, that they're calling each other out on the conflicts and on the the contradictions in each one of these characters, because everybody is flawed. Everybody's a hypocrite. Everybody kind of does things that's contrary to their base personality. So I think one of the things in creating a continuity is to acknowledge that. Like, don't just pass over it. Say like, if Superman is doing something crazy, like, Batman's there to be like, dude, what the hell are you doing? Like, that kind of thing, establishes continuity moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I think that was when we were first trying to like figure that out. That was one of the more difficult things because there is so much and there are characters that are so different from each other. So it was just trying to figure out like this is what happened. How does it affect these specific people? You know, it may affect one person more drastically than another, but we still have to, like Hector said, we still have to kind of like cover all our bases. But there's so much. It's like being in like a submarine and like holes of water just start appearing. You got to somehow plug it up like as quickly as possible before
Well,
it just doesn't make sense or it just doesn't
one
work.
one of the things that I started having Greg do because of that exact issue was after getting about halfway through our second issue of the Seer Chronicles, we started defining characters in like separate documentation, like
Hmm.
exactly information about them that even if it's not laid out, even if it's never said during the comic, by
Right.
knowing this information, we can also like basically expect what they'll do later. So for example, by saying, "Oh, this cop who's the partner of this guy," which you'll figure that out obviously,
Hmm.
but maybe his wife left him and something bad happened, and we don't ever have to explain that. But when something in the comic happens, like you could almost infer that something like this might have happened, and it's because we know that's how the character is going to be based on stuff in his life.
Right.
Hey Nate, how many character lists do we have in our drive?
So many. Oh, it's so many.
I have.
It's insane.
Dude, Dylan, exactly. I'm such a stickler for stuff like that, like having this background information. I mean, literally, we're creating a series called NLCU Legends, and it's to give background information, origin stories, things that are not going to come out in our comic storylines. And it's
Hmm.
because I was so obsessed with it, I created these huge lists and like every character that's that we have in our universe has some form of description, some form of backstory,
Well,
stuff like
what I
that.
was gonna do is we actually already kind of started this, but we're gonna go through it in more detail later. We have a Wikipedia page for our
Nice.
comic book. It's like the fandom Wikia technically,
Yeah.
but it runs off the same platform.
It's actually
And
it's
essentially,
linked
what
on our
we're
website.
yeah, and essentially what we're going to be doing is as characters come out, we're going to give them their descriptions there so you can later read and be like, "Oh, like this is why he's such a dick." Right? Like like you could figure out like, "Oh, this is why, this person's so kind because
All
of
right, Nate,
X,
we're
Y, and
definitely
Z."
doing this now. We're definitely copying that idea.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah,
Fair.
it's free to do too. It's on Fandom, but it's called Wikia,
Yeah.
Wikia, yeah. And like you can so because of that, like what we started doing was putting characters on there, and I'm like, oh crap, we probably shouldn't do that yet because we're gonna give spoilers away by doing it.
Right.
So we're
Yeah.
like we dialed that back a lot, but basically, eventually, like a lot of the backstory of them will go on there, and then anything that's in the comics, like that you actually see, we'll add as we release the comics. But we
Right.
won't. But like that'll be cool because of like like kind of like in Wikipedia when you look up Superman, it'll say in appearances in blank, right? But the
Yeah.
Right.
backstory, the origin, which will be released whenever we release various origin stories or introduce a character, we can then put them into this, the Wikipedia, and you can be like, oh, who's this guy that is the partner of X, Y, and Z, and it's like, oh, now I
Yeah.
know why he acts like that or looks like that or dresses like that or whatever. And
Right.
it's just, all of that stuff will be detailed, which is awesome.
Oh, his mom dresses him. God.
Yeah, that was one of the like big pieces of advice I gave to a good friend of mine who is working on a story for his own project. He's working on a video game and he's always like throwing ideas at me and he's always like asking me for like what do you think of this? And one time we were sitting down and he was telling me this like story idea and I'm like, "Cool, but what about this character?" And like I was just asking him some kind of like questions I felt were a little basic that he couldn't answer. I'm like, you can't write about a character, even if you created that character, and like not know even like the minor things. Like it has to be fleshed out, or else you, you don't like you're. This is why you can't figure it out because you don't know the character as well as you think you do. So I literally just sent him like, this is my personal like character sheet, and it has all the questions and descriptions that you need to fill out to, or even like add more if you're not at that point of like this is exactly who this person is from like A to B, like full fleshed out. And yeah.
Yeah, something I found recently that's been helping us do that for like side characters, but they're still important enough that you need to
Right.
know what they're thinking. Is this site called Character Generator?
Hmm.
.co.uk. And so
Yeah.
literally, like, we don't like use the character it creates because it's always really weird, but it does give a good basis. Like, even if
Yeah,
it's just a
exactly.
visual description, it's just like it's kind of like having somebody in the room that just yells random stuff, and you're like, oh, actually that one was good. I'll
Yeah,
take that one.
that
Yeah.
actually kind of works, but we'll just build on it a
Maybe
little
get
bit.
rid of
Yeah,
all this, but
yeah,
this part was
exactly.
good. This part was fine.
Hmm.
Yeah, but
That-
with oh, go.
no, I was just go ahead, Greg.
Oh. That generator actually it brought back an original idea from my story, and it took like 2 years to do that too, 2 3 years. So I originally had a bunch of different mob families like going after each other, and he then was like, so there's just like an Italian like mob family. There's like no other mob families in this entire city, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of weird. And he's like, yeah, it's really weird. So then
Get some
he
Russians in there, man.
Well,
Damn.
oh
that's hilarious. No, literally, he had this Russian mob, but like he didn't go into any detail about them. And I'm like, why do I care about them? They're just there
Yeah.
for a half a second. And he actually made it where like a good deal goes down, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like this just happens. They're just here to do this. Like no one, like there's no secret communication and all this going on. So we ended up and then not only that, he ended up having like a bunch of people meet at the same place at the same time with no reason that they're all there. And I'm like, we need a reason that they all want to meet there. So like that's what happened was we found that character generator. We started creating these extra characters to make it more full. And so like he had like Russian mobsters, and I'm like, okay, what's their names? Like how tall are they?
Anton told me there was ice cream here. That's why I came.
Yeah, so like now we've got a couple of mobsters and mafia members that are all they have character names. We now know like there's these two that go looking for someone, and they're both kind of dumb, but one's the real idiot. And so like by knowing that, it's like it's easier to like, because at one point like I'm reading the script back and forth, and I'm like, one of them seems like the smart one, and then the other one seems like the smart one. And I'm like, what's going on here? So we had to like go through and like clean it up. But now like it works perfectly, and like there's this like
when you have those
vibe.
clear character like descriptions, it's really easy to direct your comic because it's like the decisions that they would make now become the storyline. Besides, random things that would
100%.
happen to them.
Yeah.
And I also used to rush the story just to get to the cool parts. Like I rushed the original story to get to this part where certain people die in a certain way, and he's like, so we can tell that, but we're not going to tell that in the second issue because that's just like too fast. And I was like, okay.
That's the other thing is now our not only is our comic book going to be more full, so you actually care more about even like the little guys.
More development.
It's also going to be longer, which allows us to make more comics. Right. And not because we're just putting filler in, but because we're actually having more unique little side stories that are happening where, like Greg was saying, he kind of was like, I have a goal and I want to get to it. And I'm like, yeah, but we need a reason that goal becomes a goal. Right. And like that's the part that makes the comic worthwhile. Like just like all of a sudden having the Austin thing happen isn't awesome if no one knows why it's happening.